The wind didn't just howl across the valley, it screamed, like it was trying to warn Thaddeus Reed of what was coming. He was fixing a fence with hands so raw they barely felt the cold anymore. His gloves had died last week. His hope had died years ago. The last of the good hay was gone. His best bull, the one thing on this ranch worth a damn, was starving to death on its feet. This place wasn't a ranch anymore. It was a grave he was still walking around in. That's when he heard it, the crunch of wagon wheels on frozen dirt. He stood up slow, squinting. Nobody came out this far, not unless they were bringing a coffin or starting a war. And the two men in that wagon, the Landon brothers, they were never in the coffin business. Roy Landon held the reins, smug as a fox in a henhouse. His brother Clyde rode shotgun, a toothpick dancing between his teeth, his eyes holding a special kind of mean. Behind them, under a dirty tarp, something lay dead still. It was too small to be a steer, too big to be a dog. Thad stood his ground as the wagon rolled to a stop, a cold fire starting in his gut. "Morning, Reed," Roy sang out, his smile all teeth. "Brought you something." He gestured behind him with his thumb. "A blessing, you might say. Won her in a poker game down in Colorado." He yanked the tarp back, and Thad's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't cargo. It was a woman. She was maybe in her late 20s, with skin so pale it looked like it had never seen the sun, and dark hair pulled back in a tight braid. A worn wool shawl was draped over her shoulders, but it was her legs that held his gaze. Tucked under a thick quilt, they were perfectly unnaturally still. Her hands rested in her lap, calm as a prayer. "She's yours now," Clyde grunted, a nasty laugh rumbling in his chest. "Part of the pot." Thad's jaw locked so tight he thought it might crack. He stared at Roy, his mind refusing to make sense of what he was seeing. "What the hell is this, Roy?" Roy just leaned forward, enjoying himself. "Name's Elela Nena. A bit busted up from the waist down, but she's real quiet. Don't eat much. You said you needed help around here. Well, here she is." Thad's hands curled into fists. He looked at the woman, expecting to see fear or tears or rage. He saw none of it. Her eyes met his, and they were level, calm, and completely unreadable. There was a storm in those eyes, but it was far away, deep under the surface. "I won't be any trouble," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't tremble. It was the voice of someone who had been broken 1,000 times and had put herself back together every single time. "If you'd prefer, I can wait on the porch." The Landon brothers grunted as they unloaded a battered wooden wheelchair, dropping it in the dirt. Clyde then half lifted, half dropped her into it. She didn't make a sound. She just adjusted herself, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the wheels. She was all pride and iron. "All yours," Roy said, tipping his hat. "Don't say we never gave you nothing." Their laughter echoed as they rode away, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled over the dying ranch like a shroud. Thad was left standing in the cold, staring at the woman in the wheelchair. She didn't look at him. She didn't ask for help. She just started pushing herself toward the house, her wheels struggling over the frozen, uneven ground. The chair caught in a rut and pitched forward. For a second, he thought she would fall, but she just leaned, adjusted her weight, and pushed harder. By the time she reached the porch, she was breathing hard, but her face was a mask of composure. "I can sleep in a shed," she said, still not looking at him. "Or a pantry. Just somewhere dry." Thad didn't say a word. He just opened the front door and stepped aside. He listened to the soft click of her wheels on the dusty wood floor. That night she cooked. Cornbread and beans made from scraps he'd forgotten he even had. It was the best thing he'd eaten in years. She ate at the small table by the fire, her back ramrod straight. When she was done, she excused herself to the small back room he'd pointed to. He stared into the fire long after she was gone. The house didn't feel warmer, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel empty either. Something had changed. He just didn't know if it was for better or for worse. He woke before dawn to a sound he didn't recognize, a soft rhythmic creaking. He pulled on his boots and stepped outside. And there she was, la nena. Parked by the cattle pen, a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, staring at his dying bull. The massive animal was standing with its legs braced wide, its breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. "He's not eating," she said, her voice cutting through the morning chill. She didn't even turn to look at him. "Been like that for days," Thad grunted. "Vet said it's just his age, nothing to be done." She wheeled herself closer to the fence, her eyes never leaving the animal. "He's standing wide in the front and tight in the back," she said. "That's not age. That's pain." She paused, her gaze sharp and focused. "It's grain bloat. Subacute acidosis. His gut can't handle the feed you're giving him." Thad just stared at her. How could she possibly know that? "You know about livestock?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. She hesitated for just a second. "I know enough." A bitter laugh almost escaped him. He should have told her she was crazy. He should have walked away and let the bull die. It was going to anyway. But he didn't. Instead, he heard himself ask, "What would you do?" 2 quarts of mineral oil, she said immediately, without a flicker of doubt. "Get a long-necked bottle and force it down his throat. Then you walk him, all day and all night if you have to. You have to keep his gut moving or he'll die before noon." He stared at the frail-looking woman in the wheelchair, then at the 1,000-pound bull. It was insane. It was impossible. "You sure?" he asked. Elena finally turned and looked at him. Her eyes were like dark chips of flint. "Would I have said it if I wasn't?" He didn't know why, but he believed her. He fetched the oil. Getting it down the bull's throat was a fight, a battle of sheer will against panicked muscle. But they did it. And then they started walking. Thad on the lead rope, pulling the massive groaning animal, and Elena right beside them, wheeling her chair through the dirt and manure, her eyes fixed on the bull. She monitored its breathing, the tension in its muscles, the look in its eyes. She was like a general on a battlefield. She barely spoke, except to give a firm direction. "Keep his head up. Faster now, don't let him stop. Watch his left flank, see how it's twitching?" They walked in slow, endless circles as the sun set and a cold moon rose in the sky. The wind picked up, biting at their faces. Sometime after midnight, something shifted. The bull let out a long, low groan. Its breathing eased. The tension in its body seemed to melt away. Elena let out a sigh so faint Thad almost didn't hear it. He looked at her then, really looked at her. Her hair was a mess. Her face was smudged with dirt and flushed from the cold. But her eyes were alive, burning with a fierce, focused intensity. This woman wasn't a prize won in a card game. She wasn't a burden. She was a goddamn storm, and he had just invited her to break over his broken-down life. The morning after they saved the bull, a new kind of silence settled over the ranch. It wasn't the silence of death and decay he was used to. It was the silence of something holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The bull was grazing, moving slow, but moving. The bloat was gone. It wasn't a miracle. It was competence. And that scared Thad more than anything. He walked into the cabin, and the smell of coffee hit him like a welcome punch. Elena was at the stove, stirring something in a skillet, her movements sure and practiced. She didn't look up. "There's enough for 2, she said. He poured a cup and sat down across from her. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. "Thanks," he finally managed to say. She just nodded. "He's not out of the woods yet," she said, her eyes still on the skillet. "You need to change his feed. No more cracked corn. Stick to hay and grass for a while." Thad watched her, trying to piece it all together. She had dark shadows under her eyes, but her voice was as steady as a rock. How do you know all that? He asked. Her hand paused for a fraction of a second. My father was a veterinarian, she said, her voice flat, offering no more than the bare facts. I watched him for years. It wasn't the whole story. He knew it, but he also knew not to push. Not yet. After they ate, she wheeled herself out to the porch and took a small leather-bound notebook from a satchel he hadn't noticed before. He found her there an hour later, sketching furiously. It wasn't a drawing. It was a diagram. Boxes, circles, lines connecting everything. What is that? He asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. A rotation schedule, she said without looking up from her work. You're overgrazing the southern pasture. The soil is dying. If you divide the land into 4 sections and rotate the herd every week, the grass will have time to recover. He felt a flash of anger. You think I haven't tried rotation? I think you haven't tried the right kind, she shot back, her voice still quiet but sharp as a razor. And I think you've been working this place alone for so long, you've forgotten how to listen. The words stung because they were true. He'd been talking only to himself for years, and he'd been giving himself nothing but bad advice. That afternoon, they mapped the property. He walked. She rolled. She drove stakes into the ground and tied twine between them, marking out the new pastures. She knew the names of grasses he'd only ever called weeds. She pointed out patches of earth where the ground was packed hard as stone from the cattle standing in the same place for too long. At one point she stopped, reached down from her chair, and crumbled a bit of dirt between her fingers. Too alkaline, she muttered. Thad just stared. You can test soil with your hands? She actually smiled then, a small faint curve of her lips. Don't you? Over the next few days, she was a whirlwind of quiet, relentless efficiency. She organized the mess in his tool shed. She labeled the feed bins with charcoal. She found a stash of old veterinary manuals he'd forgotten he had and started reading them by the fire at night. He found her one day trying to get up a makeshift ramp of old planks into the second, smaller barn. She refused his help. You're going to fall, he said. I've fallen before, she answered, her arms straining as she pushed the wheels. The world doesn't end. That night he found himself watching her as she read, her hands turning the pages. They were scarred and capable. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was just quiet. She never asked about his past, about what had broken him and sent him out here to rot. But she left a space open, an invitation without words. And one night, over a stew she'd made, he found himself filling that space. I used to build bridges, he said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. Good ones. He waited for her to react, but her expression didn't change. Then one of them collapsed, he continued, the old shame coiling in his gut. People died, and they blamed me. Was it your fault? She asked, her gaze steady. Not entirely, he said. The materials were substandard. I think it was sabotage, but I could never prove it. It didn't matter. I was finished. People love a simple villain, she said softly. It makes them feel safe. He looked at her, a new understanding dawning. You know a thing or two about that. For the first time, she met his eyes and held his gaze. I know what it's like to be written off. The wind rattled the shutters, but for the first time, Thad felt like the storm was outside the house, not in it. Outside, the cattle were grazing on a fresh pasture. The land was breathing again, and so, it seemed, was he. This woman, this impossible, infuriating, brilliant woman, hadn't just saved his bull. She was saving his entire world. And he was starting to think the price would be everything he had left. The next morning, the air was different, cleaner. Thad found Elena by the creek, checking the water flow into the troughs. He brought her a cup of coffee. Why didn't you just tell me who you were? he asked, the question that had been eating at him for days. She looked up, her expression guarded. And who do you think I am? Someone who knows things, he said. Real things, not just some. Prize somebody won in a card game. Her face hardened for a moment, the mask slipping back into place. Then it softened. Would it have mattered if I had? She asked quietly. When you first saw me, what did you see? He didn't have an answer for that. At least not one he was proud of. Later, as they were moving fence posts, a neighbor rode by. Old Man Crawley. He slowed his horse, tipped his hat, and stared. Heard you had help, Reed, he called out. Didn't believe it till I saw it. Thad just grunted. Ella Lenena offered a polite, unreadable nod. As Crawley rode away, Thad saw the look in his eyes. Pity, curiosity. Thad turned to her. You all right with that? I'm used to being underestimated, she said, her voice even. Sometimes it's an advantage. That evening, they sat on the porch as the sun bled across the horizon. The silence was comfortable now, a shared space instead of an empty one. You were right, he said, breaking it. About what? I forgot how to listen. She didn't answer right away, just watched the first stars begin to appear. We all forget things we used to be good at, she said. She closed the notebook she was always writing in. I used to be good at believing people could change. He looked at her then, not at the wheelchair, not at the capable hands, but at the woman, the one who had survived something he couldn't even imagine and still had the strength to save a stupid bull and an even stupider man. Maybe you still are, he said. They just sat there as the sky turned a deep bruised purple. For the first time in a very long time, Thad didn't feel like the world was ending. He felt like it was just beginning. But beginnings are often the most dangerous part of the story. The rain started just after dawn, a soft, steady weeping from a gray sky. Thad stood in the barn, the smell of damp hay and warm animals a small comfort. He looked over at Ella Lenena. She was near the wide barn doors, a blanket over her lap, that leather notebook open. She'd been out there since sunrise, charting things he didn't even know you could chart. Calf weights, feed consumption. You treat that notebook like it's the Bible, he said. In a way it is, she replied, not looking up. Numbers don't lie, people do. She flipped a page. It was a grid filled with tiny, precise handwriting, pasture rotations, soil nutrient estimates, even rainfall averages she'd somehow calculated. How? He asked, his voice full of a frustrated awe. How do you know all this? She finally looked up. I told you my father was a vet. That was only half true. Before that, he was a professor at the Georgia Agricultural College. I didn't have playgrounds. I had barns and laboratories. I listened. I learned. A knot tightened in Thad's chest. This was it, the real story. So what happened? He asked, sitting on a sack of feed across from her. Her gaze went distant, looking out at the rain but seeing something else entirely. After my mother died, it was just the two of us. He taught me everything. Planned to leave me his practice, his land, his research. He knew no college would take a woman, especially not one like me. But he didn't care. He said my mind was the only thing that mattered. Her voice was flat, reciting a history she'd worn smooth with remembering. But when he passed away, my uncle came, with lawyers and paperwork. He said I wasn't capable of managing an estate. He said I was damaged goods. He took everything. Thad knew that feeling, the helplessness of watching your life get signed away by someone else's hand. So they sent you west? He asked gently. No, she said, and a new coldness entered her voice. They sent me to an institution, in Colorado, a religious place. They said it was for my own good, a place where women like me could be cared for. She looked at him then, and her eyes were haunted. Have you ever been somewhere so quiet you start to forget the sound of your own voice? He just nodded. He'd lived in that quiet for years. A year ago, she continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper, a man came to visit. Said he was a friend of the family. Said he'd found a good man willing to marry me. A second chance, he called it. The rain drummed harder on the tin roof. It was Roy Landon. Thad's blood ran cold. He convinced the nuns to release me into his care. He promised them I'd have a home, a purpose. Instead, he locked me in a back room of a cabin for 3 weeks. I don't know what he was waiting for. Then he said he'd found someone to sell me to. She took a shaky breath. Then he lost me in a poker game. You should have told me, Thad said, his voice rough with an anger he didn't know he was capable of. Would it have changed anything? She asked. Yes, he said too quickly. Then softer. Maybe. She leaned back, the fight going out of her for just a moment. I've learned it's better not to lead with the truth. People make up their minds about what you are the second they see you. He stood up and walked to the barn door, watching the rain wash the world clean. He felt a weight of guilt so heavy it threatened to crush him. He was part of it. He'd looked at her and seen a burden. I can't fix how you got here, he said, his back to her. But I swear to you, I won't let them take anything else from you. Ever. She was silent for a long moment. Then, he heard her wheels turn. She came up beside him. Okay, Thad, she said softly. And that one word felt more like a vow than anything he'd ever heard. The rain stopped that afternoon, leaving the world washed and new. They worked in the garden she had designed, him digging where she pointed. You need to plant legumes here, she told him. Beans, clover. They'll fix the nitrogen in the soil. He couldn't help but chuckle. This place didn't exactly come with a science lab, you know. You don't need a lab, she said, a rare smile touching her lips. You just need to know how the land breathes. Later, he found her at the table, that notebook open again. I've been thinking, she said. If we dig a channel from the North Creek, we can irrigate the pasture and the garden without draining the well. He looked at her, at the fierce intelligence burning in her eyes. You really are planning on staying that long, aren't you? Her pencil stilled. She looked up, her gaze direct and unflinching. Do you want me to? He didn't hesitate. Not this time. I think this place needs you. I'm not talking about the land, Thad. He met her eyes, and for the first time he let her see all the way in. Neither am I. Outside, the clouds parted, and the first stars appeared. Something new was growing on that broken-down ranch. It wasn't just the clover in the garden. It was hope. And it was terrifying. And it was the only thing that mattered. But hope has a way of attracting storms. The thunder came just after midnight, a violent, cracking roar that shook the little cabin to its foundations. Thad was out of bed in an instant, pulling on his boots. He could hear the cattle, a low rumble of panic from the pens. He burst out into the driving rain. The wind was a physical force trying to push him back. The herd was spooked, slamming against the fences. He was wrestling with a gate latch, his hands slick with mud when he saw her, Ella la Nena, wheeling herself through the churning yard, already soaked to the bone. What in God's name are you doing out here? He roared over the wind. The barn! She yelled back, her voice thin but determined. You left the south stall open. I heard it banging in the wind. He was stunned into silence for a second. Then he ran to her, grabbing the back of her chair and pushing her through the mud and toward the relative safety of the barn. They stumbled inside, both of them dripping and gasping for air. You didn't latch the upper window either, she muttered, brushing wet hair from her face. He just stared at her, then let out a laugh that was half disbelief, half admiration. Are you planning on running this entire ranch from that chair? Seems like someone needs to, she shot back. The words weren't mean, just true, and they hit him harder than the wind. They stood there in the dark barn, the storm raging outside, water pooling at their feet. He grabbed a dry sack and handed it to her. She started to towel off her arms, her face, her lap, her movements quick and efficient. He knelt to help, but she flinched, pulling back slightly. "I've been doing this a long time," she said. "I know," he said, his voice softer now. "But that doesn't mean you have to do it alone anymore." She looked at him then, and for a second, the mask was gone. He saw the exhaustion, the pain, and the incredible, unbreakable strength beneath it all. Back in the house, with dry clothes and hot coffee, the storm outside seemed to fade. But a different kind of storm was brewing between them. "You said your father wanted to leave you everything?" Thad said quietly, staring into the fire. "What happened? After they sent you away?" She took a long time to answer. "The house, the clinic, it was all sold. My father had kept everything in his name, thinking it would protect me, but it just made it easier for my uncle. He had the law on his side. I had a wheelchair." Her voice was empty of self-pity, which made it all the more heartbreaking. "They put me on a train. No windows. They took me to a place they called a facility for special women. There was nothing special about it. It was just a place to put the people you wanted to forget." His hands tightened around his mug. "I was there for 2 years," she whispered. "Then Roy Landon showed up. He spun some story about knowing my family, about a man out west who needed a wife. The nuns, they wanted to believe him. And God help me, I wanted to believe him too." A bitter, broken sound escaped her lips. "He took me to a shack near Canyon Ridge and just left me there. For weeks. Then one night he came back, threw me in the wagon. I saw the playing cards on the floor. And he lost you," Thad finished, his voice a low growl. She nodded. "To you." He looked at her, the guilt of physical sickness in his stomach. "I didn't know. I never thought you did." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty. It was full of everything they had both lost. "You could have broken," he said, his voice full of wonder. "Most people would have." She turned from the fire to look at him. "Oh, I did," she said softly. "Just not in the way they wanted me to." He leaned forward, his world shrinking down to the woman sitting across from him. "Your father taught you how to fix things. How did you learn to survive?" "He taught me how to mend bones and diagnose diseases," she whispered. "I had to teach myself how to live with a broken world." The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks into the air. And in that moment, sitting with this woman who had been through hell and built a fortress inside herself, Thad felt a shift deep in his soul. It wasn't just about saving the ranch anymore. It was about being worthy of the person who was saving him. "You belong here," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. She turned her head slowly, her eyes searching his. "That's a dangerous thing to say." "Why?" "Because I just might start to believe you." The morning was clear and calm, the world scrubbed clean by the storm. As they inspected the garden, Thad asked the question that had been hovering between them. "Do you ever think about leaving?" "All the time," she said without hesitation. "But where would I go? I don't want to be an object of pity. I want to have a purpose." He understood that more than she knew. "Then maybe we can give you one. Right here." She glanced back at him over her shoulder. "It's not just me who needs a purpose, Thad. You do too." They stopped by the pasture. The bull, their first victory, stood strong among the herd. Thad gripped the top rail of the fence. "I think we're going to need more fencing," he said. A real smile lit up her face. "Good," she said. "That means you're starting to believe this place can actually hold something." He looked at her, the morning sun catching in her dark hair. "Yeah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think it can." Something was taking root in the tired soil of Broken Creek Ranch. It was more than just hope. It was a partnership, and it was about to be tested in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. The first sign of real spring wasn't a flower. It was a stubborn line of clover pushing its way through the mud by the chicken coop. Elena saw it and allowed herself a small, secret smile. Across the yard, Thad was chopping firewood like a man possessed, each swing of the axe a blow against the ghosts of his past. "You're going to throw your shoulder out," she called. He stopped, leaning on the axe, a grin on his face. "Not if I get it in one swing." "That's not how shoulders work, Thad." He walked over and she handed him a piece of parchment, another one of her diagrams. "Water diversion," she said. "If we dig a trench from the East Ridge, we can use the snowmelt to irrigate the garden. It worked in Georgia. The slope here is even better." It had become their language, her plans, his hands, her vision, his strength. For the first time, he didn't see a fragile woman in a chair. He saw an architect, an engineer, a force of nature. They worked all day, hauling stones, digging the trench. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. But that night at supper, she was quiet. A different kind of quiet. Tense. Worried. After they cleaned up, she asked him to walk with her. Under a sky littered with stars, she stopped the chair by the fence line. "I used to think that if I just worked hard enough," she said softly, "if I was quiet enough and good enough, the world would eventually forgive me for not being able to walk." Thad leaned against the fence post beside her. "You don't owe the world a damn thing." "No," she said, "but try telling the world that." She took a deep breath. "I didn't come here looking for a savior, Thad. I don't need you to be one." "I know," he said. "You came here because you were dealt a bad hand." A faint smile touched her lips. "And you kept me because you thought I was a burden you had to carry." He couldn't deny it. "This place," she said, her voice gaining strength, "it's healing, and so are we. You feel it too, don't you?" He nodded. "It's not just the grass that's coming back. Then we have to protect it." The next morning, the threat arrived. A rider on the horizon. Thad knew that silhouette. Roy Landon. He rode up to the gate, the same smug look on his face, but there was something new in his eyes. Envy. And a challenge. "Heard your cattle don't look like they're knocking on death's door anymore, Reed," he said, swinging down from his horse. "Must be getting some special kind of help." "You're not welcome here, Landon," Thad said, his voice a low growl. Roy just smirked, his eyes flicking past Thad toward the house where Elena was watching from the porch. "So she's still breathing? I'll be damned. Guess you found a use for her after all." That was it. Thad took a step forward, his fists clenched. "You get on that horse and you ride. And if you ever come back, I'll make sure you leave with fewer teeth than you came with." Roy held up his hands in mock surrender. "Easy there. Just checking on my investment." He swung back onto his horse, but his parting words were laced with poison. "Just remember, Reed, some things don't stay buried forever." As Roy rode off, Thad felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He turned and saw Elena on the porch, her face grim. "He's not just watching us," she said. "He's spreading rumors." Thad nodded. "Then we'd better make damn sure that what we're building can survive a fire." He didn't know how right he was. The storm was coming, not a storm of wind and rain, a storm of men. 3 days later, the first shot was fired. It wasn't a bullet, it was a letter, tucked under the barn door, weighted with a rock, official seal of the Territorial Agricultural Office. Thad's hands felt cold as he opened it. Elena looked up from her charts as he walked into the house. She saw the look on his face and knew. "What is it?" "Official inspection notice," he said, his voice flat. "They're sending a team next week. Says they've received reports of unusual improvements here." Reports? From who? They both knew. Roy Landon had been poisoning the well, talking to every rancher in the county, whispering lies. "He's making it sound like we're cheating," Thad said, slamming the letter on the table. "Like you're some kind of witch and I'm your fool." Elena took a slow, steadying breath. She looked him straight in the eye. "He's not angry, Thad. He's scared." "Scared of what?" "Of being proven irrelevant," she said, her voice cold and clear. "Of a woman he threw away as worthless building something he never could." "They're coming to tear it all apart," Thad said. "Let them," she replied, her chin lifting. "We don't run, we don't hide, we prepare." For the next 5 days, they worked like their lives depended on it, which in a way they did. She brought out binders he never knew she had, soil samples meticulously labeled, water flow maps, feeding logs going back months. Every single thing she had observed, every change she had made, was documented with scientific precision. "I didn't know you were building a legal case," he said in awe. "I wasn't," she said, her pencil flying across a fresh sheet of paper. "I was building something they couldn't deny." The inspectors arrived on a Tuesday, 3 of them in city clothes that looked ridiculous out here. Their leader, a man named Felton, had eyes that missed nothing. "We'll need to see everything," he said. "Your livestock, your pastures, your records." Thad nodded stiffly. "You'll get it." Elena watched from the porch, silent and still, a queen overseeing her domain. They spent 4 hours crawling over every inch of the ranch. They were impressed, Thad could see it, but they were also suspicious. "Who designed this irrigation system?" one of them asked. "I did," Thad said. "And the pasture rotation?" "Mine." "The breeding program?" "I oversee all of it." He lied without flinching. He would protect her. He would take all the credit and all the blame. Back in the house, they pored over her records. Felton raised an eyebrow. "These are remarkably detailed, Mr. Reed." "I don't like to guess," Thad said. As they were leaving, Felton paused on the porch. "Everything appears to be in order," he said, his eyes lingering on Thad. "But an operation like this doesn't change this drastically, this quickly. It raises questions." It was then that Elena spoke, her voice cutting through the tension. "Then perhaps you should ask better ones." Felton turned, surprised. "And you are?" She looked him dead in the eye. "I'm a resident of this property, and I'm the reason his cattle aren't dead." The inspector stared at her for a long moment, a flicker of understanding, maybe even respect, in his eyes. Then he tipped his hat and left. As their wagon disappeared, Thad sank onto the porch steps. "Well, that could have gone worse." Elena was still watching the horizon. "It's not over," she said. "You think they'll be back?" "No," she said, her voice grim. "I think they'll send someone worse." She was right. But before the next enemy arrived, she unearthed an old one. 2 days later, she wheeled into his small study. "I found them," she said quietly. "Your bridge designs." He spun around. "You were going through my desk." "I was looking for ledger paper," she said calmly. "The drawer was stuck. When I pulled, they fell out. I read them, Thad. The calculations, the stress variance, the design wasn't the problem." He let out a long, bitter breath. "They said it was arrogance, that I rushed it." "No," she said. "Someone else rushed it." She held up a yellowed newspaper clipping, the original accident report. She had underlined certain phrases. "Substandard materials, altered cement mixture, reduced foundation depth." "Someone changed your specs after you signed off on them," she said. "You were framed." He just stared, the world tilting on its axis. "I've already written to 2 of my father's old colleagues," she continued. "One of them is on the Territorial Engineering Board." "You had no right," he exploded, the old pain roaring back to life. "I had every right," she shot back, her voice ringing with a fierce loyalty that stole his breath. "Because someday, people are going to stand on a bridge you built. And when they do, I want them to be standing on the truth." He collapsed into a chair, the fight draining out of him. "I buried that man," he whispered. She wheeled closer, her expression softening. "Then it's time we dug him up." A letter arrived the next day. The board was officially reopening the investigation. It was a long shot, but it was a shot. It was a start. And as the sun set that evening, another rider appeared on the horizon. This one wasn't a bully or an inspector. He was dressed in a fine black coat, his hat trimmed with silver. He radiated power and easy arrogance. He dismounted at the porch. "Mr. Reed, Miss Whitfield," he said, his smile thin as a razor's edge. "I am Councilman Everett Caldwell. I believe we have a great deal to discuss." The real storm had just arrived, and it was wearing polished boots. Councilman Everett Caldwell didn't bother waiting for an invitation. He swept into the small cabin like he owned it, two grim-faced men trailing behind him. One carried a leather portfolio, the other looked like he knew how to break things. Elena wheeled back, her hands tight on the rims of her chair. Thad stood his ground, a silent, immovable wall. "I understand you've been busy," Caldwell said, his voice smooth as poison. "Innovating, improving. It has come to the attention of the Territorial Council." He gestured around the simple room. "All of these advancements, the water channels, the livestock yields, they are of significant interest." "You say that like it's a crime," Elena said, her voice steady. "Not a crime," Caldwell corrected. "A matter of public interest. Unregistered innovation, you see, requires regulation, especially when there are questions about where these innovations originated." He had one of his men open the portfolio. "The council has reason to believe that the methods used here were not developed on this ranch, that they are, in fact, intellectual property belonging to others, acquired improperly." Thad's voice was a low growl. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Caldwell said, his eyes finally landing on Elena, "that a woman with no credentials, no formal training, and no public record doesn't just invent an entirely new system of agriculture overnight, unless, of course, she had help, or she stole it." "She's not a criminal," Thad bit out. Caldwell gave a faint, condescending smile. "No one has accused her of being one. Yet." The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Then Elena rolled forward. From her satchel she produced a folder of her own. She laid it on the table with a hand that did not shake. Inside were her charts, her diagrams, her soil analyses. But there was something else on top. A letter, bearing the official seal of the Territorial Agricultural Office. "A grant for temporary recognition of experimental practices under the Sustainable Homestead Act," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "I've documented and filed every step of our process, legally. This is our land, our water, our work. Nothing was stolen." Caldwell's smile faltered for just a second. He glanced at the documents but didn't touch them, as if they were contaminated. "One more thing," Elena said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out another envelope, this one sealed with red wax. "My application for full territorial citizenship. It includes letters of reference from 2 agricultural boards and 3 certified engineers. It was approved yesterday." She laid the certificate on the table. The embossed seal caught the lamplight. "This gives me the legal right to live here, to work here, and to register any innovation I create, including every single one you see at Broken Creek Ranch." The room was dead silent. One of Caldwell's men shifted his feet. The other one had lost his smirk. Caldwell stood frozen for a long moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he picked up his gloves. "Well," he said, his voice tight, "that certainly complicates things." "You mean it ruins your plan to steal our ranch?" Thad said. Caldwell's eyes turned to ice. "Plans can change, Mr. Reed. So can alliances. Be very careful who you trust. It's much easier to build something than it is to keep it. And with that, he turned and strode out of the cabin, his men scrambling behind him. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing the threat he'd left behind. Elena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That was too easy, Thad muttered. No, she said, her eyes dark with a grim understanding. That was a declaration of war. They spent the next few days fortifying their position. Elena wrote letters to everyone she could think of, engineers, agricultural boards, even a few newspapers. She was building an army of paper and ink. Thad rode into town, talking to neighbors, carefully undoing the damage Roy Landon's lies had done. 5 days later, the mail wagon brought 2 letters. One was for Elena, an invitation to speak at the State Agricultural Conference. The other was for Thad. It bore the seal of the Engineering Review Board. His hands trembled as he opened it. The words blurred together. Reopened investigation, new evidence submitted, tampering in construction, original findings contradicted, and then the final line. The board has voted to clear the name of Thaddeus Reed. Pending final approval, you will be reinstated. He looked up at Elena, unable to speak. That's the part of you I was trying to bring back, she said softly. He walked to the window, the letter clutched in his hand. The man he thought was dead and buried was breathing again. Not just a rancher, an engineer, vindicated. He felt her wheel up beside him. You know this means they'll come for us even harder now, she said. He looked down at her, a fierce protective fire lighting in his chest. Then we'll make damn sure they find us ready. The next storm wouldn't be fought with paper. It would be fought with fire and steel, and they would be waiting. The summons arrived with the sunrise. Not a letter this time, a posse. Roy and Clyde Landon led the way, waving a stack of forged documents. Behind them, looking miserable, was Sheriff Avery, and bringing up the rear, looking like a king surveying his new territory, was Councilman Caldwell. We're here on legal business, Reed, Clyde shouted. This land is private, Thad said, stepping out onto the porch, his body a shield in front of Elena. You've got no right. Caldwell dismounted, his movements elegant and precise. Mr. Reed, Miss Whitfield, I did warn you. Some things are too valuable to be left in private hands. Sheriff Avery stepped forward, holding up a hand. I'm just here to verify the paperwork, he said, his voice grim. Let's keep this civil. Elena rolled forward, her back straight, her chin high. Then let's begin. She handed the sheriff the leather folder, the one containing her citizenship, her property deeds, her development claims, her registered innovations. Every page was a testament to her foresight, a weapon she had been sharpening for months. The sheriff read in silence. The Landons shifted from foot to foot. Caldwell waited, his arrogance a tangible thing. Finally, the sheriff looked up, his expression one of grudging respect. These are all valid. Roy Landon sputtered. That can't be. She is a full, recognized citizen of this territory, the sheriff interrupted, his voice sharp. Every seal, every signature, it all checks out. Caldwell stepped forward, his smooth composure finally beginning to crack. The documents may be official, but the spirit of the law. This isn't about spirit, Councilman, Elena cut in, her voice like ice. This is about the law, and for once, it is on my side. Caldwell's eyes narrowed into slits. You've made powerful enemies, he hissed. Let them come, Elena replied, her voice ringing across the yard. We're not going anywhere. The sheriff took the Landons' forged papers, held them up for all to see, and ripped them in half. Nothing but ink and lies, he said. Now get off this property. The Landons, defeated, scrambled back into their wagon. Caldwell gave Elena one last look, a look that promised retribution. This isn't a victory, he sneered. It's just a delay. He mounted his horse and rode away. The silence he left behind was the most beautiful sound Thad had ever heard. It was the sound of a battle won. Inside, Thad's hands were still shaking as he poured coffee. I thought I was going to have to throw him off the porch. Elelanina had a small, triumphant smile on her face. I would have helped you. They sat at the table, the morning sun streaming in. You did it, he said finally. You saved this place. She looked down at her cup. I saved us, she corrected. But it's not enough. Now we have to make it mean something more. She pulled a folded letter from her pocket. It was the invitation from the Montana Livestock Association. They want us to come to the spring conference in Helena, she said. They want us to teach other ranchers our system. He looked at her, his heart swelling with a pride so fierce it almost hurt. Are you going to go? Not alone, she said, meeting his gaze. This is our work, Thad. Our ranch, our story. We go together. The trip to Helena felt like a journey to another world. The conference hall was filled with powerful men in clean suits. They stared as Thad wheeled Elelanina onto the stage. He could hear the whispers, see the smirks. Then she began to speak. Her voice, clear and strong, filled the hall. She didn't talk about her struggles. She talked about science, about soil and water and life. She laid out their system with a brilliance and clarity that silenced the entire room. When she finished, there was a moment of stunned silence. Then the applause started, not from everyone, but from enough. Later, a man from the association board approached them. He held a certificate in his hand. Miss Whitfield, he said, his voice filled with a new respect. By a unanimous vote, the board is proud to recognize you as the territory's first certified land and livestock management consultant. She took the paper, her hands trembling slightly. Thad leaned down. Told you they'd listen, he whispered. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I just didn't think I'd be alive to hear it. You're not just alive, Elelanina, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You're leading the way. Her victory was no longer just about their ranch. It was about every person who had ever been told they were worthless, every soul that had been cast aside. But victory has a price, and they were about to find out just how high it was. When they returned to Broken Creek, the quiet was wrong. It was too still. The air felt heavy, charged with a waiting malice. They had won the battle of wits and paper, but their enemies had other weapons. It happened 2 nights later. A sound from the darkness. Hoofbeats. Fast. Angry. Thad was on his feet in an instant, yelling for Elelanina as he sprinted for the barn, but he was too late. The barn was already a torch against the night sky. A trail of oil glistened on the ground. The flames were eating the old, dry wood with a hungry roar. The horses were screaming. He worked the water pump until his muscles screamed, but it was useless. The fire was too big, too hot. By the time the neighbors arrived, the barn was collapsing, sending a shower of angry embers into the sky like a swarm of demonic fireflies. The livestock was saved. Everything else was ash. Sheriff Avery arrived at dawn. He didn't waste time with questions. I know who did this, he said, his face a grim mask. Caldwell. He wouldn't do it himself, but he paid someone who would. This is retaliation. You embarrassed him in public. Now he's trying to burn you out. Thad looked at the smoking ruins of their hard work, a cold, killing rage building inside him. But Elelanina, her face smudged with soot, was already looking past the destruction. Then we plant something deeper, she said, her voice hard as steel. Something he can't burn. She didn't write a letter to the government, she wrote a letter to a journalist. 3 days later, their story was on the front page of the Montana Sentinel. Disabled pioneer battles corruption. Ranch burned in retaliation. The photograph showed Elelanina proud and defiant in front of the ashes. The territory exploded. Letters and telegrams poured in. Ranchers offered supplies, labor, breeding stock. A family from 3 counties over sent a prize stallion with a note that read, "What you're building belongs to all of us now." But Caldwell wasn't finished. The morning after the article ran, a summons arrived. He was suing Elena for libel and defamation. "It's a trap," Thad warned. "He'll bleed us dry in court." Elena didn't even flinch. "Then we'll fight him in court." The ranch had become more than just land. It was a symbol, a line drawn in the dirt. Volunteers arrived to help Thad rebuild the barn, this time with stone, a foundation that fire could not touch. The community that had once whispered about them now stood with them. And as they prepared to ride to Helena one more time, not as victims but as warriors, Thad took her hand. "It's not over yet," he said. "No," she agreed, her grip strong and sure. "But it's ours." The courthouse in Helena was a fortress of stone and judgment. A small crowd had gathered outside. Reporters, ranchers who had driven for days, people who had read her story and come to see the woman who refused to break. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Caldwell sat with his lawyer, the picture of smug confidence. But Elena saw the slight tremor in his hand, the tick in his jaw. He wasn't confident. He was a bully who had cornered something he thought was weak, only to find out it had teeth. When she took the stand, a hush fell over the room. She didn't tell a sob story. She told the truth. Fact after fact, she laid out the campaign of harassment, intimidation, and corruption. She detailed how Caldwell's influence had been used to steal her family's land years ago, and how he was trying to do it again. "I was not targeted because I lied," she said, her voice clear and ringing, her eyes locked on the jury. "I was targeted because I succeeded, and because I dared to do it without asking for permission from the men who believe they own success itself." The trial was a landslide. Sheriff Avery testified about the fire and the suspicious circumstances. Neighbors testified about her brilliance and her generosity. When the jury returned, it took them less than an hour. Verdict for the defendant, Elena Whitfield. All claims dismissed. But the judge, a stern woman named Ruth Claymore, wasn't finished. In a rare public statement, she officially admonished Councilman Everett Caldwell for a coordinated effort to silence private innovation through intimidation and misuse of legal process. His career was over. His power was broken. He was ruined. When they returned to Broken Creek, the new stone barn stood finished. Over the entrance, the volunteers had hung a carved wooden sign. "The Whitfield Reed Barn, built from fire, made to last." The land was healed, the community was strong, and their future, once a barren patch of dirt, was green and growing. That night, they held a celebration under the stars. Laughter and music filled the air. Elena looked out at the faces around the fire, at the ranch that had been reborn from ashes, at the man who stood beside her, no longer broken, but whole. This was more than survival. This was a legacy. She had been thrown away, gambled, and left for dead. But she had refused to be a victim in her own story. She had become the hero. As the fire crackled and the night stretched out before her, full of possibility, she knew deep in her bones that she was finally, truly home. If you enjoyed this story of resilience and justice, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of the unexpected, and let us know in the comments what you think is the most important ingredient for building something that lasts.